Remember when corner stores had wall-length cigarette displays behind the counter and every brand told its own story through colors and logos? There was a time in Canada when cigarettes weren't hidden in plain brown boxes. They were part of Saturday errands, hockey rinks, Legion halls, and truck stop coffee runs. You'd see Sweet Caporal ghost signs painted on old brick buildings or spot a pack of Buckingham tucked in your uncle's jacket at a family barbecue. Today we're rewinding the tape to explore 10 cigarette brands that only true Canadians remember. Whether you caught a whiff of menthol on a winter morning, collected hockey cards that came bundled with tobacco packs, or simply remember the bell-clack sound of depot doors, you're about to take a nostalgia trip. Which brand will bring back your strongest memory? Let's light up the past and find out. 1. Sweet Caporal. Let's start with the granddaddy of them all. Sweet Caporal wasn't just Canada's oldest cigarette brand, it was a cultural institution that lasted roughly 125 years. Launched in the late 1800s, it survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the rise of health warnings. By the early 1900s, you couldn't walk through a Canadian city without seeing the name. It adorned brick walls, corner store windows, and sports arenas. People didn't just smoke Sweet Caporals, they lived with them. They were there when your great-grandfather worked the railway. They sat on kitchen tables during card games. They filled pockets during hockey practices and fishing trips. The cream and red flip-top packs became as recognizable as the maple leaf itself. For decades, smoking a Caporal meant you were buying Canadian, supporting homegrown industry in a country still figuring out its identity, separate from Britain and America. But even giants fall. As the decades rolled on, the market changed. International brands muscled in. Health concerns mounted. Imperial Tobacco, which owned Sweet Caporal, began trimming its portfolio to focus on fewer, more profitable names. By 2011, after more than a century on Canadian shelves, Sweet Caporal was quietly discontinued. No fanfare, no final pack ceremony. It simply stopped appearing in orders, and within months, the brand that had defined Canadian smoking for generations became a collector's item. Today, you'll find those cream and red packs in antique shops and online auctions, relics of a time when brands could own the national consciousness without a single TV ad. 2. Buckingham. If Sweet Caporal was the establishment smoke, Buckingham was the working-class hero. This imperial tobacco brand had a fierce following, especially in Quebec and the Maritimes, where it was the go-to choice for anyone who wanted a straightforward, no-nonsense cigarette at a fair price. There was nothing fancy about Buckingham, no celebrity endorsements, no slick magazine spreads, just a brown and gold pack with a bucking Bronco-style logo that promised honest tobacco for honest people. You found Buckingham everywhere blue-collar Canada gathered, in dépanneurs, at construction sites, in the cabs of long-haul trucks making the Trans-Canada run. It was the smoke your uncle pulled out at family reunions, the brand sitting on the dashboards of half the pickup trucks in rural Ontario. People chose Buckingham not because it was trendy, but because it was reliable, affordable, and unapologetically Canadian. Then came 1994, and everything changed. That year, press reports surfaced about cornstarch additives being used in certain imperial tobacco products. The scandal exploded across Canadian media, raising health concerns and triggering public outrage. Imperial responded swiftly and brutally, pulling multiple brands from shelves in a single sweep. Buckingham was delisted alongside players Special Blend, Cool, and Pall Mall. The company claimed it was about reformulation and quality control, but the message was clear: better to kill several brands than risk the reputation of the entire portfolio. For Buckingham's loyal smokers, the loss felt personal. This wasn't some international brand vanishing, it was their smoke, the one that had been there through good times and bad. Within months, those brown gold packs disappeared from stores, and a piece of working-class Canadian identity went with them. 3. Cool menthol. The word alone triggers memories for a generation of Canadians who came of age when cool meant more than just temperature. Cool cigarettes, with their iconic icy green shield logo, became the menthol standard across North America. In Canada, they represented a slice of American cool imported across the border, a taste of U.S. pop culture you could buy at your local Mac's or Becker's. Cool's branding was genius for its time. The name, the color, the winter-fresh imagery, it all reinforced the menthol experience. TV and magazine ads showed sophisticated smokers in crisp, clean environments, the menthol taste positioned as refreshing rather than harsh. For Canadian smokers who wanted something different from standard tobacco flavors, Cool was the obvious choice, especially popular in urban centers and among younger adults experimenting with different tastes. But Cool's Canadian story ends in 2 acts. First came 1994, the same reformulation scandal that killed Buckingham. Imperial Tobacco pulled Cool from Canadian shelves as part of its portfolio cleanup, ending decades of menthol dominance. Any smokers still clinging to Cool had to switch brands or hunt for remaining stock. Then came the final blow, Canada's national menthol ban in 2017. The federal government, responding to evidence that menthol cigarettes were particularly appealing to young smokers, prohibited the sale of mentholated tobacco products nationwide. Even if Cool had survived the 90s, 2017 would have finished it. Today, those icy green packs exist only in online archives and collector forums, artifacts of a time when you could legally market cigarettes as refreshing. 4. Pall Mall. Pall Mall carried the weight of international prestige. Originally a British brand that went global, it arrived in Canada as a symbol of sophistication, a step up from local smokes for those who wanted to project worldliness. The burnt orange cartons with blocky serif typography stood out on shelves, and the brand's "wherever particular people congregate" slogan suggested exclusivity without being snobbish. In Canada, Pall Mall occupied an interesting middle ground. It wasn't as ubiquitous as Players or as cheap as Buckingham, but it wasn't premium priced either. It was the choice for Canadians who wanted something with global cachet that didn't break the bank. Office workers treating themselves on payday, university students trying to look sophisticated, travelers who'd picked up the habit overseas and wanted to maintain it at home. Imperial Tobacco distributed Pall Mall in Canada, which meant when the 1994 additive scandal hit, Pall Mall went down with the ship. Pulled alongside Buckingham, Cool, and Players' Special Blend, it disappeared from Canadian stores almost overnight. Unlike some brands that lingered in certain regions or returned in modified forms, Pall Mall's Canadian chapter closed for good. The brand continued elsewhere globally, but for Canadians who'd made it their smoke of choice, 1994 marked the end. Those burnt orange cartons became another memory, another example of how quickly a seemingly permanent fixture could vanish from daily life. 5. Players' Special Blend Players was, and in some forms still is, Canadian tobacco royalty. The sailor icon, the navy blue packaging, the racing sponsorships, the working-class pride attached to the name, Players represented authentic Canadian smoking culture for generations. So when Imperial launched Players' Special Blend as a variant, promising a smoother, more American-style taste, it carried the weight of the parent brand's reputation. Special Blend was positioned for smokers trading up or down within the Players family. Maybe you found regular Players too strong. Maybe you wanted something that felt less harsh on weekday mornings, but still carried that familiar sailor logo. Special Blend offered a middle path, using lighter tobacco blends and updated marketing to appeal to evolving tastes in the 80s and early 90s. But brand loyalty couldn't save it from the 1994 purge. When Imperial pulled the plug on multiple brands due to the additive controversy, Player's Special Blend was sacrificed, while the core Player's line survived. The decision made business sense: protect the flagship, cut the variants, but it stung for Special Blends fans who'd made it their daily smoke. Within months, the softer-colored Player's packs vanished, and smokers had to choose: return to regular Players, switch to competitors, or quit altogether. Today, the Sailor icon still appears on tobacco products in Canada, but Special Blend remains dead and buried, a footnote in the Player's story. For those who smoked it, though, it represents a specific moment when Canadian tobacco companies were still experimenting, still trying to capture different market segments before regulations and plain packaging made such fine distinctions impossible. 6. Richmond. The late 1960s brought a wave of health anxiety around smoking. Studies were piling up. Governments were starting to pay attention. Tobacco companies responded not by admitting harm, but by promising safer alternatives through technology. Enter Richmond, Imperial Tobacco's experiment with the Strickman high-filtration tip, an advanced filter design that supposedly reduced harmful elements while maintaining taste. Richmond's marketing leaned hard into the low-yield narrative that dominated late 60s tobacco advertising. Ads boasted about scientific innovation, filtration efficiency, and reduced tar. The pack design embraced tight, modernist aesthetics, clean lines, understated colors, a forward-looking vibe that said, "We're solving yesterday's problems with tomorrow's technology." For health-conscious smokers unwilling to quit, Richmond offered a compromise: keep smoking, but do it with a filter that supposedly made it safer. Except it didn't. The filtration claims, like most tobacco health reassurance marketing, fell apart under scrutiny. Smokers found the taste disappointing. The low-yield promise didn't translate to actual safety. By the early 1970s, Richmond had quietly disappeared from Canadian stores, withdrawn by Imperial as the experiment failed. The brand name eventually resurfaced elsewhere as a discount cigarette, with no connection to the original. But in Canada, Richmond's high-tech moment lasted barely 5 years. What makes Richmond memorable isn't longevity, but what it represents: the industry's attempt to engineer credibility during the first wave of serious health pressure. It was a preview of the light and mild marketing that would dominate the next 2 decades before regulators finally banned such claims as misleading. Those modernist packs are now collector's items, physical evidence of how companies sold illusions of safety to keep customers hooked. 7. Viscount. Speaking of illusions, let's talk about Viscount, Benson & Hedges' answer to the growing demand for mild cigarettes in the 1960s and 70s. Marketed as Canada's mildest, Viscount rode the same wave of health reassurance advertising that propped up Richmond, but with better execution and longer staying power. Viscount's clean, pale packaging reinforced the mildness message. Magazine spreads showed sophisticated smokers enjoying gentle, refined tobacco experiences. No harsh coughing, no burned throats, just smooth, civilized smoking. The brand became part of a fierce tar-number war between competing companies, each trying to claim the lowest yields, the lightest smoke, the safest option for people who refuse to quit. For a generation of Canadian smokers, Viscount represented a responsible choice. You knew smoking wasn't great for you, everyone knew by the 70s, but Viscount promised a middle path. Keep the ritual, the social aspect, the post-meal satisfaction, but do it with a milder product that supposedly posed less risk. People smoked Viscount in office break rooms, at dinner parties, on camping trips, anywhere sophistication and restraint mattered. But mild was always marketing fiction. Studies eventually confirmed that light cigarettes were no safer than regular ones. Smokers simply inhaled more deeply or smoked more frequently to get the nicotine they craved. As regulations tightened through the 80s and 90s, and as plain packaging laws eliminated the ability to use words like mild or light, Viscount lost its entire selling proposition. The brand faded through portfolio consolidation and regulatory pressure, disappearing province by province as retailers dropped SKUs that no longer made sense. Those pale packs with their mildness promises became another artifact of tobacco's most desperate marketing era. 8. Medallion. If Viscount was mild, Medallion was ultra-mild, a cigarette so light, so filtered, that smoking it became the butt of jokes. Sucking air was the common complaint. The filters were so ventilated, the tobacco so sparse, that actual smoke seemed optional. But that was the point. In the race to create the lightest, safest cigarette, Imperial Tobacco's Medallion pushed the concept to its limit. Medallion's white-on-white packaging communicated purity, refinement, ultimate mildness. The delicate crests and ultra-mild badges promised an almost cigarette-free cigarette, all ritual, minimal substance. For certain smokers, particularly those trying to cut back or switch from stronger brands, Medallion offered a transitional product. You could still hold a cigarette, still participate in smoking culture, but with supposedly reduced intake. The reality? Medallion epitomized everything wrong with light cigarette marketing. Smokers compensated for the weak draw by smoking more, inhaling harder, blocking ventilation holes with their fingers. The ultralight category, which seemed like harm reduction, actually encouraged behaviors that maintained or increased exposure. By the 1990s and 2000s, scientific and legal challenges to light cigarettes intensified. Studies proved they offered no health advantages. Lawsuits mounted. Regulators cracked down. Medallion, like many ultralights, quietly disappeared during the mergers and SKU cuts that followed. Imperial trimmed overlapping brands, focusing resources on products with stronger market positions. Those white-on-white packs, with their promises of ultra-mildness, vanished from shelves, remembered now mainly as symbols of an industry's most cynical period, when companies sold the illusion of safer smoking while knowing full well it was a lie. 9. Sportsman. Now here's a brand with a story. Sportsman cigarettes, produced by Carreras and later Imperial, embraced rugged outdoor imagery long before adventure marketing became ubiquitous. The brand's angular logo and fishing fly artwork made it instantly recognizable, and its sports sponsorships, hockey, baseball, fishing derbies, embedded it deep in Canadian recreational culture. You saw sportsmen everywhere. Working-class Canadians played and gathered. Gas pumps, arena boards, community center walls. The brand's tie-ins with sports felt natural and authentic. These were cigarettes for men who worked hard and played harder, who fished northern lakes and coached minor hockey, who gathered at Legion halls to tell stories over draft beer and tobacco smoke. The fishing fly artwork in particular became iconic. Beautiful, detailed illustrations of tied flies appeared on tins and packs, collectible items that appealed to anglers, whether they smoked or not. Some of these designs now sit in museum collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, preserved as examples of mid-century commercial illustration. But Sportsman's identity became its death sentence. As Canada tightened tobacco advertising restrictions through the 1990s and 2000s, sports sponsorships were specifically targeted. The government recognized that tobacco companies used sports marketing to associate their products with health, vitality, and Canadian identity, associations that contradicted everything known about smoking's harms. When sponsorship bans took full effect, brands like Sportsman lost their entire cultural reason for being. Without hockey rinks to sponsor, without fishing derbies to support, without the sports imagery that defined the brand, Sportsman had no story left to tell. Imperial phased it out during portfolio consolidations, recognizing that a sports cigarette couldn't exist in a world where tobacco and sports were legally separated. Those tins with their beautiful fly illustrations became collectibles, antique shop finds that remind us of a time when cigarettes and Canadian recreation were openly, legally intertwined. 10. Cameo. Let's end with Cameo, a brand that bridges eras and represents tobacco's long arc from ubiquity to restriction. Introduced in 1935, Cameo offered menthol options for Canadian smokers for over 7 decades. It started with cork-tipped menthols, elegant, old-fashioned, almost medicinal in their presentation, and evolved through Filter Kings and modern packaging as styles changed. Cameo was never the biggest menthol brand, but it was steady, reliable, present. It filled a niche for smokers who wanted menthol freshness without the aggressive marketing of brands like Kool. It sat on shelves in small-town pharmacies and urban corner stores, a quiet alternative that loyal customers returned to year after year. The green-white menthol cues on the packaging signaled exactly what you were getting. No surprises, no gimmicks, just straightforward mentholated tobacco. By 2011, Imperial Tobacco decided Cameo's time had passed. The brand was folded into a Du Maurier menthol revamp, consolidating menthol offerings under a stronger name. For Cameo smokers, it meant switching to Du Maurier or finding another menthol entirely. But this turned out to be a temporary problem. In 2017, Canada implemented a nationwide menthol ban, prohibiting the sale of mentholated tobacco products. The government's reasoning: menthol cigarettes were particularly appealing to young smokers, and banning them would reduce youth smoking rates. With that 2017 ban, not just Cameo but the entire menthol category disappeared from legal Canadian commerce. Du Maurier menthol, Export A menthol, every green packaged menthol variant, gone. What had been a standard option for decades became illegal to sell. For menthol smokers, it meant adapting to non-menthol brands, quitting, or seeking black market alternatives. Cameo's journey, from 1935 cork tips to 2011 consolidation to 2017's menthol ban, tells the whole story of Canadian tobacco regulation in miniature. It shows how brands that seemed permanent could be erased by business decisions and legislative action, how an entire flavor category could be outlawed, how the shelves that once held dozens of colorful options could be reduced to plain brown boxes with health warnings covering every surface. So tell us, which of these vanished brands do you remember most clearly? What's your story? The pack you spotted in a drawer, the billboard you passed every day, the smell that clung to someone's coat. Drop your memory in the comments below. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into Canadian nostalgia, the snacks, the stores, the habits that defined decades and then disappeared, hit subscribe. We're just getting started.